So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zoe Ryder, and I'm the Director for Civic Engagement at the Project on Government Oversight. Really thrilled to have so many supporters and partners and friends of the Project on Government Oversight to join us today for our town hall on the American federal response to our domestic security threats. There's a few things I want to go through before we introduce our panelists, just really quickly, so you can understand how this fancy platform Crowdcast works. You'll see to the right that you have a chat function, and anything you put there is public for everyone to see. So unless you're somehow registered anonymously, we will see your name, and because this is recorded, you should know that. That is not the right place to post a question. If you've done that, that's fine. We will hopefully get to everyone's questions, but you'll see in the lower bar, there's an ask a question function. If you open that, you can see a few people have already posted questions. Many thanks to you all. Shout out to Gordon, one of our ambassadors. And you can vote, you can upvote questions. So if you think, trying to understand what the inspectors general need to do to better support the nation's response to domestic security threats, you want to vote for Gordon's question. I think you get the idea. Anyone can post questions. We're going to definitely set aside at least 15 minutes, if not more, at the end of this discussion to give a really full-throated round of discussion with all of you who have joined today. I may also jump in when I see a question that seems really pertinent to the discussion at hand, but since I'm not very good at multitasking, don't wait for that. You'll also see a button that says call to action, and you can click on subscribe to sidebar. So that'll take you to the Project on Government Oversight's newsletters, but highly recommend that you click on registering for sidebar, because that's sort of the latest and greatest updates from the entire team of the Constitution Project on issues related to constitutional infringement by the government, issues that we work on related to depoliticizing the courts, tackling impunity of federal officials and so forth. And it's a weekly, and it's a really good read. So I highly recommend you sign on to that. As we go forward, we're gonna do sort of a round of questions. And what we're really trying to get at today is to understand four things. So first, from what we already know, to what degree was January 6th in part resulting from failures in our anti-domestic terrorism efforts, from what we already know. And then we want to understand, in calculating our response, are we actually going to make problems worse? And what do we need to do to make problems better? Finally, we want to really understand who are the communities most affected by misaligned domestic terror policies, and what do we need to do to go forward to make sure that our domestic terror policies are in fact making us safer, and to not commit some of the mistakes of the past that our panelists are going to speak to you about. So I am very thrilled to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Catherine Hawkins, who is Senior Legal Analyst for the Project on Government Oversight, and she focuses primarily on national security, immigration, and human rights. Her expertise in the use of torture by the United States in the wake of 9/11 is world-renowned. And we're really thrilled that she's coming to speak to us today on the sort of state of play of our domestic terrorist legislation and proposals going forth. Second, we have Jake LaPerouse, who is senior counsel at POGO and who, in his own right, is a leading expert in government surveillance and monitoring, whose widely cited work highlights the ways in which emerging technologies are rapidly impacting our constitutional rights and principles. And as you guessed it, not for the betterment. Finally, again, just really thrilled to have Michael German here with us. So Mike is a beloved ally of the Project on Government Oversight. He's worked at the FBI from the late 80s until 2004 as a special agent. At first, Mike worked on financial crime, going after wealthy financiers who caused the S&L crisis. But then he switched gears to work on domestic terrorism, going undercover, infiltrating white supremacy and far-right extremist groups to identify criminal actors. Now, Mike left the FBI after reporting on a myriad of the Bureau's deficiencies with respect to counterterrorism. He made these reports to Congress and subsequently faced retaliation. So after leaving, Mike went to work as general counsel for the ACLU and is now fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, their Liberty and National Security Program. And since leaving the FBI, I wanted to say the Bureau because I felt very insidery when I thought of it. He has been writing extensively on the ways that US law enforcement has failed to respond to the far-right domestic terror threats. This includes, most recently in 2019, his book, Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, How the New FBI Damages Democracy. This is a book that basically chronicles how the FBI transformed itself after 9/11 from an enforcement agency known for prosecuting organized crime and corruption to a highly secretive domestic intelligence agency. And his first book, Thinking Like a Terrorist, Insights of a Former FBI Undercover Agent, was published in 2007 and was basically the creative impulse behind the movie Imperium, which is a fictional account fashioned in large part fictionally on Mike German's life as a domestic terror undercover agent for the FBI. So let's get started. I have to say, introducing you guys takes a really long time because you guys have done such amazing things.
And let me clear up that I wasn't general counsel to the ACLU. I was a policy counsel in the Washington Legislative Office.
Got
so
you. Thanks
more,
for that.
more than a few steps down the chain there.
Yeah, you know, what did they know?
Thank you,
So let's get at it. This is for you, Mike. Please help us set the scene. So at the FBI, now Brennan Center, you've been working tirelessly to ensure the most effective response possible to the threat of domestic terrorism, with a specific focus on far-right extremism. Now, from what we already know, to what degree was January 6th in part resulting from failures in our anti-domestic terrorism efforts? And to what degree should we have seen this coming?
So anyone could have seen this coming because it was planned in plain sight. These groups have been publicly violent for the last 4 years and have been very vocal and outspoken on public platforms about their intent to commit violence. And the violence they've committed at public protests has been escalating over the last 4 years, including 2 weeks before the attack on the Capitol, an assault on the Oregon State Legislature, where they breached the building, fought with police officers, beat up press. So the idea that our law enforcement agencies weren't prepared for the attack, I think, is an indictment of the law enforcement intelligence establishment that we've built since 9/11 and invested considerable resources in and granted them access to personal data about Americans, not based on any belief that they have engaged in any kind of wrongdoing. So I think it shows the failure of that methodology completely. And we can get into the discussion of why law enforcement tends to look at white supremacists and far-right militant violence as less of a threat than even protest by racial justice groups, social justice groups, and environmental justice groups.
Thanks. I think, and we will be deep diving into that shortly. I just wanted to go over to Catherine for a second and ask her, okay, so January 6th happens.
Mm-hmm.
What are the proposals out there that we're seeing coming from the Hill, coming from the Biden administration and elsewhere in response to January 6th? And are these the right responses?
Sure. So, I mean, one obvious response was to impeach former President Trump. That was appropriate. I think searches for accountability, both with the former president and the individuals who invaded the Capitol, but also looking at the failures of the Capitol Police, which is this incredibly well-funded police department that really just was asleep at the switch, even though some individual officers defended the Capitol very bravely. The rank and file just voted no confidence in their leadership. So pushes for a look into what went wrong is totally appropriate. There have also been calls, not so much, I don't think there's been specific legislation proposed since January 6th, but there has been renewed attention to some proposals out there to basically extend the laws against international terrorist organizations to domestic terror organizations. And that, I think, would be a huge mistake. The laws, there are quite a lot of laws against domestic terrorism. It's not exactly the same legal regime as against so-called international terrorist organizations, but there are a lot of authorities just sort of lying around that haven't begun to be used yet. And giving new authorities to law enforcement when they don't use the authorities that they do have is a mistake.
So you're basically saying, am I clear, that legally there's no additional authorities that would have prevented January 6th that are needed?
I think there were really pretty obvious signs that were missed. I mean, a casual example, my daughter's preschool knew to close down that day in downtown Washington, D.C., but right. The Capitol Police weren't ready. So I think when you don't use authorities that you do have, increasing your power doesn't make any sense. And I think broad domestic terrorism authority won't be used against the far right unless the police change their and law enforcement changes their prioritization.
Thanks. So Jake, let's assuming we have the sufficient capabilities in terms of our legal framework, then is this a problem? Was January 6th really just a failure of surveillance and intelligence gathering capabilities?
So the short answer is very much no. I think the first level of that are the basic features that Catherine and Mike have already spoken to. The fact that there was a huge amount of what's called open source intelligence, just information that, is publicly available, publicly able to read, being posted on these social media platforms, websites and things like that, you don't even require any legal authority to go get. That can just be part of kind of preparing for a big public event, is checking if anyone's planning anything nefarious. But even if we have scenarios that are a little more clandestine, where we expect individuals might be talking to each other or masking attempts, or if, again, here, I think there were some pretty big oversights that led to just all these people simply walking away. But if we had a scenario where people actually had been, had escaped a scenario like this and we wanted to try to catch them, there are lots of tools in place for that. The government's ability to, when it has probable cause, to monitor communications, to monitor web browsing activity, to track individuals' locations based on their cell phone, or use of all kinds of apps on your phone, is very vast. And a lot of the time, actually, the problem with these factors is that, especially for those involving new technologies like cell phone tracking, facial recognition, etc., because they're so new, there actually aren't even kind of those basic due process checks in place of getting a warrant, getting probable cause in ways that, for scenarios like this where you very clearly have evidence of wrongdoing would not be an obstacle to, show that probable cause. But I think kind of the short version to say there's a huge amount of powers, tools, and authorities for various surveillance and intelligence gathering activities that can be used. Right now we don't really have any cases where police their hands are tied behind their back in that respect. In fact, quite often we have kind of a Wild West scenario where for things like facial recognition and until very recently something like cell phone tracking, there were few, if any, laws limiting their ability, law enforcement's ability to just use this however they wanted.
So, okay. So we have the right capabilities in terms of surveillance, in terms of intelligence, in terms of the laws on the books. So like, Mike, really take your time to really unpack how this event really occurred.
So the Justice Department and the FBI have long deprioritized the investigation and prosecution of white supremacist and far-right militant violence in their domestic terrorism program. And they deprioritized domestic terrorism in the counterterrorism program. So the FBI Assistant Director for Counterterrorism testified that 80% of counterterrorism resources go to international terrorism cases. And the 20% that's left goes to domestic terrorism, but then that's broken up among various categories. White supremacists was a category. What they called Black identity extremists was a category. Anarchists was a category. Environmentalists was a category. And far-right militias was a category. And there were about half a dozen more. So within domestic terrorism, far-right militias and white supremacists are by far the most active and the most violent and produce the most fatal attacks. But what has long happened is that the FBI has prioritized the less violent groups. For instance, for many years, the FBI publicly said eco-terrorism was the number one domestic terrorism threat, even though there's not a single homicide related to environmental actions across the country. Later, the FBI prioritized this concept they have of Black identity extremists, where they cobbled together 6 events over 3 years where a Black person committed a violent crime even though these 6 people didn't know one another, they weren't part of the same organization, they didn't share any common ideology, the FBI morphed them into what it called the Black identity extremist movement, and then initiated a nationwide investigation called Iron Fist to target this category, even though there was really no discerning features of the category, except that the subjects of these violent crimes that they identified were Black. So it basically was open season to go after Black political activists, particularly activists who were protesting police violence and racism. On the white supremacist side, the FBI doesn't even collect data about the scope of their violent crimes. So we don't know from the government, for instance, how many people white supremacists kill every year. We don't have that figure because the government doesn't count it. The FBI every year produces a bank robbery report that explains in detail every bank robbery that occurred in the United States because they collect that data. But they don't collect data on white supremacist crimes. And in fact, white supremacist crimes are broken up into 3 different categories. If a white supremacist killed somebody, the FBI could call that an act of domestic terrorism, or they could call that a hate crime if the person that they killed was part of a protected class. Most often, the FBI treats, well, if they consider it a hate crime, they don't even investigate it. They turn that over to state and local law enforcement because the Justice Department has a long-standing policy to defer the investigations of hate crimes to state and local investigations and prosecutions, despite the fact that they have 5 federal hate crime statutes. So that's part of the problem, is it goes into this black hole because we know state and local police most often don't investigate or prosecute hate crimes or even acknowledge that they occur. But most often when the federal government looks at white supremacist violence, it treats it as organized crime, gang activity. So they treat that as just regular violent crime. And even though those statutes also are very powerful and very effective in targeting terrorist groups, because any organized group can be targeted under those programs. So it's an effective methodology. But the problem is they do that to keep those numbers out of the terrorism statistics that would then challenge the way the FBI divides its resources.
So what have you seen the impact of this over the last 15 years?
Well, it's been a persistent problem for decades, going back to when I worked undercover in these cases. It wasn't as if there was a big national push from FBI headquarters to work the cases. It's just the two cases that I worked. There were very effective case agents who overcame the bureaucratic hurdles that would otherwise be put in front of them. So it's a long-standing lack of attention to this problem. Over the last 4 years, however, it became more acute because we had a president who was encouraging these groups and lauding them in many cases, and also encouraging law enforcement lawlessness in a way that put law enforcement and these groups on the same side of the issues, targeting a common enemy, which Donald Trump called Antifa, which was ill-defined and basically meant anyone who opposed Donald Trump's policies. So what we had was public violence committed by these groups that the police weren't standing in the way of and didn't investigate in most cases, and them traveling around the country to engage in this violence while publicly stating their intentions, with the FBI not tracking that interstate travel clearly. So these groups became much more dangerous because they believed that their violent activity was sanctioned. So the more violent people began to be attracted to these events where they could engage in public violence without any repercussions. And so, I've written 3 reports about this over the last 3 years because I could see the increasing threat that was being posed by this lack of attention to these crimes. And so, I'm not on Parler. I'm not on the 8chan and 4chan. I don't follow these groups. I heard plenty of what they had to say when I was undercover with them. I know what they're talking about. I just followed the news reports where local reporters were covering the violence that they were committing in their cities and towns. And that, of course, like Jake said, is completely open source. That's available. That's published in news articles. It's put on internet videos. It's out there, and there is no reason that law enforcement chose not to address that violence long before the attack on the Capitol, but certainly not to be prepared for that attack showed that they weren't even paying attention to what was an event that was planned entirely in public.
And have you seen that sort of the effects of this on the environmental and the social justice groups? Have there been real tangible effects?
Certainly. I mean, so this is part of the problem with the argument for a new statute. I mean, first of all, it's fallacious on many different angles, right? This idea there isn't a domestic terrorism law. There is an entire chapter of the code book called Terrorism that includes 57 federal crimes, 51 of which apply to domestic terrorism. There are 5 federal hate crime statutes that target the kind of crimes white supremacists often commit. There are organized crime statutes and violent crime statutes. In fact, the Justice Department prosecutes twice as many domestic terrorism cases than it does international terrorism cases. So the idea that international terrorism is somehow this very effective model that should be adopted ignores the fact that domestic terrorism prosecutors, with 1/5 of the resources, actually produce twice the convictions in that program. So it's completely nonsensical if you actually look at the facts. The problem is in the domestic terrorism program, they're targeting environmentalists, they're targeting Black Lives Matter activists, they're targeting Standing Rock water protectors. They're not looking at white supremacists. So giving them new authority without changing their policies and practices, which, by the way, they could have changed yesterday, or they could have changed after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville descended into violence. They could have changed those policies any step along the way, but they haven't, which leads me to believe, as an investigator, that's what in law enforcement we used to call a clue, that they're not really interested in changing their policy that deprioritizes the investigation of white-collar crime. They're interested in using a brand new authority against groups like the Disrupt J20 protesters. And that was 230 some protesters who were arrested during an anti-Trump protest because a window was broken, and charged with felonies by the Justice Department and prosecuted over the course of the year. And there are serious allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. And most of those cases ended up in dismissals, because showing up in black to a protest, in fact, is not evidence that you are conspiring to riot. But if they could have a broader charge, perhaps they could have won those cases. And again, so there are real abuses happening of domestic terrorism laws that exist. Why would we want to give them another one when it's just a mere policy that's preventing them from using these same laws to go after white supremacist violence?
Thank you. Catherine, do you want to add to that? Are there additional risks and dangers of expanding the terrorism laws that keeping you awake at night?
So one thing I want to be clear on is that although there is ample authority to go after domestic terrorists under existing statute, there is even more authority to go to prosecute what's called foreign terrorism. And whether something is defined as domestic or foreign terrorism can depend on, frankly, the religion of the accused. A U.S. citizen who doesn't have a connection to international terrorism organizations, but retweets in support of ISIS, can be charged with material support for a terrorist organization. And while most of the laws that apply to foreign terrorism don't also apply to domestic terrorism, the material support charge, which is very, very easy to prove, does not. And I think so that is why there's a push to broaden that to domestic terrorism, but I think it would be a huge mistake. I mean, the FBI's use of those laws has often been, there have been these elaborate sting operations that verge on entrapment, where pretty marginal people are basically where the FBI supplies most of the plot, and people who go along with it then have the book thrown at them. There's also a federal sentencing enhancement for terrorism crimes that is almost exclusively used to drastically expand the sentences of people convicted of terrorism. But again, it's mainly targeted at Muslim or foreign suspects. It's not used in domestic terrorism cases. And so I think it's actually an equal protection problem that we have different legal regimes depending on the race and religion of the suspect. But I don't think the solution is to expand due process violations further, because I think the most likely outcome of that is that they would just be applied to entirely domestic groups. I think that the FBI did investigate Black Lives Matter, but it didn't, that they can't pretend that they are a foreign group. I think that it just sort of would broaden the category of dissent that can be targeted.
Thanks. I did just take a quick look at the questions, and I do see there's a lot of interest from the audience to really understand from you, Mike. Like, we understand that the FBI and Department of Justice have deprioritized the far right extremists and white supremacists. But could you say a little more about what you think the sort of, as Rachel puts it, the historic, cultural, political, systemic reasons for why they've deprioritized far right extremism?
So I think what you have to understand is in so many of these discussions, we try to present white supremacy as this extremist belief on the margins of our society. This is the skinhead with the tattoo of a swastika on his forehead, and not much education and a lot of anger, and that certainly exists. But that's not what the white supremacist impact in the United States is, right? And it's interesting that at the Capitol attack, people seemed shocked that military officials and former military officials and law enforcement officials and members of city and state legislatures were part of the mob, and some of whom were arrested for illegal activity alleged at the Capitol, where that's always been the case, right? Our nation was founded as a white supremacist project, right? European colonization of the quote unquote New World. It wasn't a new world. There were people that lived there. The genocide of the Native Americans, the chattel slavery of Africans, racism was the law. White supremacy was the law for hundreds of years. And even after slavery was banned, Jim Crow and black codes existed throughout till the civil rights movement made them illegal on paper, but didn't end them. I mean, there were sundown towns across the United States up until the 1970s, and they may still exist. So we have to understand how white supremacy is woven through all of our institutions, including our law enforcement institutions. And of course, that's where these manifestations are often most visible and most dangerous, because we give law enforcement great power to use violence against the citizenry. So, the FBI, for example, remains overwhelmingly white. I think it's 83.5% white and 80% male. So, it's not by accident. That's because there is this structural racism that continues to infect our institutions. And so when a white male FBI agent is given these new authorities that Jake and Catherine have been talking about, that allow them to target people not based on evidence of wrongdoing, but based on what threat I imagine they might pose in the future, they're going to look at people different from them as more threatening than people who are similar to them. And that's similar in ideology, similar in appearance. So that's why it's easy for them to say that these Muslim communities are more threatening than white communities, that Black Lives Matter is more a threat to what they see as the proper social standards than the violence that white supremacists are engaged in, that is actually reinforcing those social standards. So it's less of a threat to them personally and their families. And so, we haven't really as a society wrestled with how white supremacy continues to infect all of our institutions. And hopefully the attack on the Capitol at least opens up that discussion, because again, it's not as if they didn't have members of Congress even supportive of this kind of violence and this kind of activity. And that's what, as a society, we need to address. But there are certainly plenty of laws for the Justice Department to just focus on the violence. I don't think that they should be focused on ideology. They should focus on policing the violence, and that will be enough to keep them busy for some time if they actually focus on the violence.
Thank you. Well said. And Jake, can you talk a little bit how you see these tendencies play out in surveillance?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it goes to kind of the point Catherine was raising. I mean, I think, someone might be listening to us talk about why these authorities are necessary and say, okay, maybe they're not necessary, but maybe you guys are wrong. Why not just expand the authorities anyway, just in case? I mean, the answer is very much that there is huge potential for abuse in, expanding terrorism authorities. And generally, what's the harm if we do it? The harm is that these tend to already, to the extent that they can, whether it's surveillance power, prosecutorial power, be used to target and disproportionately go after marginalized communities. I mean, there's a very long history in the United States of surveillance of minorities, of activists, of dissidents. Even if we just go to the last 20 years, I mean, there's a long history throughout the 20th century, but just in the last 20 years, and there was a huge amount of incredibly problematic surveillance directed at Muslim communities after 9/11. In the past 5 years, we've seen a significant amount of surveillance activities, both from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, I think even to a larger degree, as far as we know, directed at Black Lives Matter activists. And these are the type of things that could become much more significant if you expand terrorism authorities from the international side to the domestic side. Probably the biggest example in the surveillance context are Patriot Act provisions. There are others, but just kind of one example of that, and maybe kind of a forward-looking issue of that. So there's a provision in the Patriot Act that it actually expired last year and might come up again this year. The big debate about that, by the end of that debate in Congress, was, well, should we put limits on the ability of the Section 215, it's also called the library provision, because you can use it to grab library records or any other records without suspicion in international terrorism cases. Should we put a limit on that so you can't just grab web browsing data without a warrant? Now, I think Mike mentioned earlier, there was actually kind of a similar issue for the J20 protests in 2016. The Justice Department, they wanted to grab every single person, the records of everyone who had visited the website organizing this protest with a single warrant. That went in litigation for a long time, and eventually a judge said, no, that's basically a general warrant. You can't grab the records of 500,000 people who were, visiting a site, expressing their political views on, or not even expressing, but, whose political views would be revealed if you grab this data about who visited this website. So even though you have a warrant, you can't do it for that many people. The debate in this Patriot Act authority was, well, what if we did that, but without a warrant at all? Because it's an international term investigation. And that's the type of thing we're talking about potentially expanding to for growing these authorities to the domestic side. So imagine, if you had that authority and you were able to say, I want to know everyone who visits Campaign Zero or a Black Lives Matter site or, Muslim advocates or CARE or something like that. There's a very slippery slope very quickly that can happen for those types of things.
So who has or should have authority, like oversight authority, to make sure that we are in fact using DHS, using our authorities to investigate violence and actual crime, that we're not using our law enforcement for political purposes? Where's the oversight of that now, and where should it be? That's an open question. Who wants to jump in?
Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, one thing I would like to see, although I'm not sure if they currently have the resources, is the Justice Department Civil Rights Division has done really good work investigating systematic violations of civil rights, including the right to protest by police departments. They don't tend to use the disproportionate policing that we all see, where one type of protest is treated very differently from another, is a textbook First Amendment violation. The most sort of legally suspect discrimination based on speech is when the government discriminates on the basis of viewpoint. And every set of response, every police department I can think of seems to respond to protests in a disproportionate way, based partly on race and also partly on ideology, whether it's sort of perceived as being anti-them. So I would really like to see the Justice Department take on civil rights enforcement as a real priority in a way it hasn't been.
And let me add to that, that the FBI also has jurisdiction to investigate civil rights violations by law enforcement as a criminal matter. But those cases tend to be reluctantly investigated, very pro forma, collection of records that are then passed up to the Justice Department prosecutors, who routinely decline to prosecute them. So, those authorities are there; they could be used more effectively. But as far as oversight of the federal government's response to these crimes, obviously Congress has a very important role there, and there are numerous committees, the judiciary committees in both chambers. The Homeland Security committees have some jurisdiction over this, and the Oversight and Reform Committee. So there's plenty of authority for them to do this oversight. But over the past 2 decades, since 9/11 and even before that, law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies have been very effective in not providing documents at congressional request and stonewalling congressional investigations. And on this topic, Senator Durbin introduced a bill in 2017 called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act that requested specific data from the FBI about its domestic terrorism program, both the incidents that each category that they had created resulting in fatalities, and then the number of investigations for each category, so you could see where they were disproportionately targeting groups that were far less violent. Rather than provide the data, the FBI collapsed its categories in a way that it wasn't operationally sound, but would have masked this data. It put white supremacists and these so-called Black identity extremists into a single category of racially motivated violent extremists, with the idea that now the total number of fatalities for that group doesn't reflect which ones are killed by white supremacists versus Black identity extremists, and the number of investigations is also obscure. They did the same thing with far-right militia groups and anarchists, where anarchists have not really engaged in any kind of deadly violence, at least for about 100 years, I guess. Where far-right militias have, they collapse them into a single category. So again, with the purpose of obscuring data from Congress. Moreover, data requests or demands were cemented into law through the National Defense Authorization Act. And the FBI was supposed to publish the data last June. They have yet to publish that data. So if the Justice Department and the FBI can ignore the law and ignore congressional oversight requests, obviously the ability for the public to have any confidence that these entities are doing the right thing to protect our security is lost, and they're acting in an anti-democratic fashion that is just as dangerous to our society as the violence they're not investigating.
As someone who's only spent 3 years really learning how the sausage is made on the Hill, can someone explain to me and to perhaps some of our fellow supporters how it is that these agencies can literally defy Congress here? Like, what needs to happen to change that?
This is a hard one because it's pretty structural. One issue is that Congress, in order to get a subpoena for documents or testimony or information enforced, the system for a long time was for it to go to the Justice Department and demand that the Justice Department make someone produce the evidence. Now, when so the Justice Department won't do that when it's the executive branch, and so Congress. Lately, they've been bringing civil suits, but the executive branch kind of runs out the clock in the courts. So I think having a way for Congress to sort of get information and compel information in a timely way is very important. I mean, the efforts to get various documents from the Trump administration went up to the Supreme Court. They sent it back down to the lower court, and then the cases just got dismissed before getting to any evidence being produced, because guess what? He's not president anymore. So that's a problem. There probably are laws Congress could pass to make, to get the courts to at least enforce their demands for evidence a lot sooner. They also have a power called inherent contempt that needs to be explored a bit more. But
okay, thanks. So I'm very cognizant of the time, and I want to give folks, the audience, their due on the Q&A. So what I'm going to ask, well, two things. One, I'd like to remind everyone in the audience that if you want to raise a question, please put it in the ask a question box if you haven't already. And we're going to try to get to them, as many as we can, but you definitely want to vote for the one, everyone should vote for the questions they want most answered, because that's going to help. But very quickly, I'm going to do it just a round robin to each of you. The number one thing you would like to see happen now in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. Jake.
Yeah, I think we need a 9/11 style commission, and to really look at the full breadth of failures, everything from those in the day leading up to and day of, as far as why, Capitol Police, and not just Capitol Police, but, federal law enforcement leadership just seemed so completely unprepared and inactive for this. But then, looking at like these broader causes that we've talked to, and, what, if any, are the changes that we need in government to actually make them happen, as opposed to kind of just going with the shotgun approach of just what's on law enforcement's wish list. That's something you're talking about, sort of the sausage in Congress. We've seen again and again, whether it was after the Oklahoma City bombing, after 9/11, of a lot of the policy changes that went into place were not carefully examined. In retrospect, we should do this, we should change that. It was sort of a pre-existing wish list of items that law enforcement wanted, had been lobbying for a long time, and found that as an opportune moment to say, okay, let's push for that now, or let's add that into a law you're already considering. I very much hope that we don't do that and say whatever policy changes and actions we need to be carefully deliberated and need a lot of investigating about what actually went wrong.
Catherine, one thing.
Okay, well, one thing is I would like to see the federal investigation into January 6th by the Justice Department focused not only on, in low-level wrongdoers who came into the Capitol, but on January 6th as part of a months-long attempt by President Trump to overturn the effects of an election. And I think that his individual responsibility really needs to be looked at, not because of White House pressure, but the Justice Department needs to follow the evidence where it goes, even when it comes to very powerful people. And DOJ thinks of itself as wearing a white hat and holding everyone accountable, but the fact, I mean, there have been a lot of DOJ resources to coercing pleas from nonviolent immigration offenders, and a real reluctance to investigate the powerful. So I'd like to see that change.
Thank you. Over to you, Mike.
So it's interesting. All three of us want there to be investigation, but are identifying different entities to do those investigations. I think Congress needs to do the investigation. They have the authority. They have the responsibility. And, I fear when they punt to some outside commission that's unelected, that isn't directly answerable to the people. The Senate and the House are very capable. They have the tools. They have to learn how to use them more effectively on a routine basis. So using this opportunity to establish a select committee to investigate this event, I think would strengthen our democracy and compel a more effective response from federal law enforcement. I think that improved congressional oversight of these entities is what's really needed. And the violence at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was supposedly the wake-up call, right? And that's when Congress started holding hearings, when Congress started demanding data, and the FBI all that time and the Justice Department have not cooperated with those investigations. If they had, perhaps this problem would have been addressed long before the attack on the Capitol. So what we have to recognize is that Congress's inability to get the records they need to establish sound policies is really the biggest threat to our democracy. We can't have rogue agencies refusing to cooperate in a democratic process.
Thanks. So we have 9 minutes left and a terrific set of questions from the audience. So I'm going to try to get us through as many as possible. So I ask that the answers be very short and succinct. This is a test. So first question from our former Inspector General and POGO ambassador and friend, Gordon Hedel. What specific audits or investigations do you believe inspectors general need to perform in order to support the nation's response to domestic security threats? Anyone want to jump in?
Certainly the Inspector General can audit the domestic terrorism program, both at the FBI and the Justice Department, to see how resources are actually being utilized and why they aren't being utilized to address the most persistent and most violent threat.
Got it. Thank you. Unless anyone feels a burning need to jump in on that, I'm going to go to the next question. There's a report due to President Biden on what to do about domestic violent extremism at the 100-day mark. What would you put in that report? But everyone wants to answer that question. You each get 30 seconds. Starting with Catherine, 30 seconds or less. What do you want in that report?
I think to focus on the violent part, and I can't answer this in 30 seconds.
Okay. Tough. Mike.
So I'll fill in with what Catherine said. A big part of the problem is this concept of radicalization, and I saw Woody Kaplan had in his question the same. Who decides who's an extremist? This radicalization theory suggests people get bad ideas and then become terrorists, and that's disproven through empirical research. It's a theory that the Justice Department used to go after peace activists and immigrants during the Palmer Raid period, civil rights activists during the civil rights era, and is continuing to be used to abuse communities because of their point of view, rather than focusing on actual violent crime. These groups kill people, they beat people, they harm communities through violence. Investigate the violence. Don't worry about who's thinking what.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point to underscore time and again. And it's one that I've really, really only understood from reading your reports, which are in the chat. Many links to that. This has been a point that Mike's been trying to raise. Sorry, I'm taking Jake's 30 seconds. I don't mean to. Jake, you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think just we need more data on demographics of what types of communities are surveilled, especially subject to terrorism laws, where there's often far less checks and abilities. That's also something that I would love to see IGs can dig into more, and actually trying to get comprehensive data on the demographic breakdown and how often either First Amendment activities, religious activities, or other types of speech form the basis of suspicion, either for surveillance or for designation as investigative targets. I think having that information could be very helpful in telling us how big a problem we have in these matters, how much we need to redirect efforts to other places than we're doing now.
Thank you. Anybody have anything burning to add to that before we jump to the next question? Burning is fine. Okay. This is a very interesting question. It's from Sarah Turberville. who I think some of you know. It seems like we no longer distinguish between domestic and international terrorism, or we should no longer distinguish. Why should we have two separate legal regimes and unequal treatment of these acts of violence?
The practical reason why we should have two for now is that the international one is so deeply flawed that we don't want it extended further, even though the disparity is unfair, which is not really a great answer to the question.
And I would argue that we need to get away from treating terrorism as a national security issue and treat it as a crime problem. And, that's the way it was treated before 9/11. It was the FBI treated international terrorism as a national security foreign counterintelligence issue and domestic terrorism as a criminal issue. But the reason the intelligence failed on 9/11 is because those tools are ineffective at this kind of a problem. And rather than understand that was the cause of the failure, they empowered that side of the FBI, which is why they continue to fail in this regard, because those tools are actually ineffective. Treating this as a crime problem is a much more effective way to treat terrorism.
And some people, am I right, were making that case in the wake of 9/11 as well. They just didn't get heard.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I think there's one little bit on that can make sense, which is to say that on the international terrorism side, I mean, you occasionally will have situations where, because there's a global nexus, because it's supposedly based internationally, sometimes it's harder to take investigative actions, be it surveillance, interrogations, catching people otherwise. There's some basis to that, but I think the pendulum swung so far beyond just that concept of, okay, here's why we might need different authorities, and it's kind of become an end unto itself of, international terrorism is just so serious that we need to break down the rules and barriers to however the government wants to prosecute it. I think if the government can make a case of, hey, there's no way we can serve a warrant on this foreign email company that terrorists are using, therefore we might need slightly different rules for that. Okay, let them make the case for that, but it should be based on something like that because it's beyond the reach of a court order or police here is the only time I think we should be even considering something like that. And even then, I think the government needs to make a strong case. But what we have now, I think, is that was the presumed reason when it started, but it's just become conflated for terrorism is super serious, therefore the rules should be less. Kind of going to what Catherine Meyer was saying, it's just it's a very
And let me steal 10 more seconds. So much of this debate talks about the approach to international terrorism as if it's been effective, when in fact it's been incredibly ineffective, right? Al-Qaeda is bigger and more widespread than it was before 9/11. We have to understand how ineffective those methodologies have been, which will present a clearer picture of why we shouldn't try to replicate them and in fact should narrow them.
So I'm going to give us 5 more minutes. Is that okay for the speakers?
Yeah.
Okay. And apologies to those in the audience who can't stay for another 5 minutes, but just there's just so many great questions. I want to go to Letta Taylor's question from Human Rights Watch. In brief, can you just read the tea leaves a bit? Do you have any signs that Biden will, quote, build back better on domestic terrorism? Any signs?
I don't think I could do this work if I wasn't hopeful that reason would prevail. And I hope that there is an opportunity both for Congress and the new administration to actually examine what these longstanding problems are and how to address them, rather than just throwing a Band-Aid on it with a new law or a new policy and then letting things continue the way they are. But I'm going to have to run. I'm sorry.
Okay. Then I think we're going to wrap it up here. I think we better wrap it up. It's too awkward to just keep going and keeping people past the hour. So I'm sorry to those we couldn't, whose questions we couldn't answer. This has been a really terrific conversation, and one that Pogo is really honored to host. And we hope over the next year to sort of take these issues on board, and to really ensure that we have a much more effective response when it comes to targeting domestic terrorists, those who really seek to use violence to perpetuate alteration of of our political terrain. So again, many thanks to our speakers and to the participants, and we look forward to our next town hall with you all. Have a great day.